Funding for KETC local productions is provided in part through the generous support of the Arthur and Helen Baer Charitable Foundation. And this Emmy Award-winning program wouldn't be possible without your support. Thank you to the members of Channel 9. You make it possible.
He is one of the most famous people to have ever lived in St. Louis. For over 20 years, he walked its streets, shopped the shops, and sat on the fire escapes. Yet there is barely a trace of his presence in the city. In fact, Tom Williams' time in St. Louis is better known for its ending, when he left the city and became Tennessee Williams, the acclaimed Southern playwright. History has made Tennessee Williams the adopted son of New Orleans, the writer whose boozy Southern charm and liberated sexual identity permeated the tone of his most famous literary works. But the writer he was, the writer he became, that started here, where a young Tom Williams was a sullen teenager from a troubled home with an obsession for writing. Tom spent the first 7 years of his life in Clarksdale, Mississippi, with his mother Edwina and sister Rose. They lived with Edwina's parents. Her father was a minister and a leading citizen. Tom's father, Cornelius, or C.C., came from a family prominent in Tennessee history and was a traveling salesman for a shoe company. He was rarely at home, and that was an arrangement that worked well for the entire family. All of that changed in 1918 when C.C. was promoted to sales manager, an office job at company headquarters in St. Louis. C.C. liked the big city, but for the rest of the family, it was an unfamiliar setting. And Edwina was always conscious of social standing, and in St. Louis, they didn't know anyone, and no one knew them.
She had been celebrated, as a beauty and so forth, in this little town of 6,000 people. So you can imagine the change to St. Louis, which was then the fourth largest city in the United States, and they moved there, was, to her, a terrible tragedy.
The culture of his family told him that St. Louis was not as good as Tennessee or the South. His writing in the junior high and high school were about, awful, smoky, dirty St. Louis.
Cornelius saw it as a wonderful advantage, which it actually was. Had good schools, art museum, forest park. It had all sorts of advantages they hadn't had in this little bitty town.
They moved to a fashionable neighborhood. Westminster Place was a street of fine homes, but the Williams family didn't own one of them. They rented an apartment at the end of the block. Tom was enrolled in nearby Eugene Field School, where the small, sickly boy with a Southern accent was immediately a target of bullying.
Even as a child, his stories are about being picked on at the grade school when he was little. And I think probably, maybe more than anything else, was growing up in that very, very dysfunctional household.
His father was no longer on the road. For the first time, the entire Williams family had to live all together under the same roof.
It was about the worst family situation you can imagine.
He was witness to a lot of quarreling in the house. There was a lot of, yelling and screaming in the house when the father was there.
Cornelius was not a very nice man, and beyond his personality, drank and was out of control, it seems like, a lot of the time.
They had another child, Dakin, who in time would become C.C.'s favorite, especially as Tom showed more interest in reading and writing than sports. C.C. would ridicule his older son by calling him Miss Nancy. Tom's closest relationship was with his sister Rose, who was 2 years older. In these years before mental illness began to dramatically affect her behavior, they were inseparable.
His sister and he were the sort of buffer against the parents. It was the sort of one pillar in his life was always Rose.
The Williams family moved often as Edwina searched for better social standing for herself and better schools for her children. Their third move enabled Tom to attend a new, innovative junior high, where he would write for the school paper. And when he started high school at Soldan in St. Louis, Edwina was already looking to move a fourth time to the new suburb of University City. They still could not afford a house, but there was a large complex of apartment buildings, and the family moved into a building on Enright Avenue, which has since been torn down, but which was very similar to the ones that remain in that neighborhood today. That fall, Tom enrolled in University City High School.
He really didn't fit in at all. He didn't make any friends there at all. And he developed this strange habit of blushing. And nobody's ever explained it, including himself, but it was very embarrassing to him.
From time to time, he would burst out in sort of odd laughter at things that was often inappropriate. But I think it was that he was on his own wavelength, and he was tuned into things with his own sense of humor and his own sense of what life was like.
In high school, his vivid imagination was already starting to pay off. He won $5 in a magazine essay contest on the topic, "Can a wife be a good sport?" Few would have guessed that the man writing about his unfaithful wife was actually a 16-year-old boy. And the summer before his senior year, Tom's byline appeared in another national magazine. Weird Tales paid him $35 for a story of intrigue and revenge set in ancient Egypt. It was a memorable summer. Tom bought that issue of Weird Tales at a newsstand in New York City, just before he boarded an ocean liner. He was the guest of his grandfather, the Reverend Dakin, who was leading a group of parishioners on a European tour. Tom had remained close with his mother's parents over the years, and in many ways, his grandfather was more supportive than his own father. It was not the last time the Reverend Dakin would provide Tom with an opportunity his own parents couldn't give him. During those weeks in Europe, he wrote in his journal detailing his experiences in Italy, France, and the Netherlands. And when the world traveler returned that fall for his senior year at University City High School, he wrote a series of articles for PEP, the school newspaper.
So when he got back home, his position had entirely changed, you know. They were very glad to have him on the school paper, and he was very glad to be there, so he did blossom out finally.
Buoyed by his literary accomplishments, Tom Williams decided he would go to the University of Missouri and enter its acclaimed journalism program. The fall of 1939, he boarded a train at the nearby Wabash station and headed for Columbia, Missouri. This was finally the escape that he had been searching for, a path to the life he wanted, a life away from the family strife and social inadequacies. The 3 years he spent at the University of Missouri were the most stable and happy he had known since leaving Clarksdale. Although he was still known as something of an oddball, he had friends, he went to parties, and he joined a fraternity. With a degree, he might have gotten a newspaper job. Plenty of writers, from Twain to Hemingway, had started out in journalism. But just a year from graduation, he was abruptly thrown off that path. Tom had flunked the required ROTC class, and whether it was that or financial issues, CC would not let him go back for his senior year. He got Tom a job where he worked at the International Shoe Company downtown.
Those are two very intriguing years where we don't have a whole lot of information.
After 3 years of college, of personal and creative freedom, Tom Williams was again trapped in the dysfunction of the family's Enright apartment and driving to work every morning with his father in strained silence.
Now, Williams at the time thought of himself as a poet. You can imagine how a poet would feel sitting in a warehouse 8 hours a day typing out shoe orders.
While the next 2 years were miserable and frustrating for Tom, they were, for the writer he would become, some of the most important years of his young life. He was getting the kind of education that no university could provide. And it was these experiences that would make deep impressions on the young writer and eventually find their way into his greatest works.
I think he's a very autobiographical writer. Those conflicts in the family, in the city, in himself, in his own section, in his own body, were things that he worked out through his whole life.
The presence of these years is most strongly reflected in The Glass Menagerie, in which a young writer, Tom, spends his days working in a warehouse and his evenings going to the movies to escape his tiny apartment and oppressive family. He put so much of himself into his writings that it's easy to confuse Tom Williams with the character Tom Wingfield. But The Glass Menagerie is a fictionalized version of his life, focusing only on a mother and daughter and son. In the play, the father has abandoned the family, and the setting is a cramped city tenement, far more bleak than the Williams suburban apartment.
He did exaggerate some of the poverty, but at the same time, I'm sure he felt spiritually impoverished here. It was a tenement in his mind.
So Tom's big motivation was to get out. He went to Forest Park and the Art Museum and the zoo, and he went to the Tivoli Theater practically every night.
He also found refuge in the swimming pool in this building called the Lorelei, where he had first taken swimming lessons as a boy.
He went swimming a lot. Being underwater was the one place he could sort of escape from the world around him.
You know, I think swimming is a solitary activity, just like going to the movies, to the library and reading, or sitting in the park or going to the art museum to look at the paintings. I think that's who he was. He was an observer and a thinker and a dreamer. And so swimming seems like a good activity for someone who wants to do that.
While at the University of Missouri, the life Tom Williams wanted seemed within reach. Now the illusion of that life had been shattered, and cracks began to appear in his physical and emotional health. The relentless tension with his father, his sister Rose's rapidly deteriorating mental health, and the deadening monotony of his job had taken a toll. And he began again to have the kind of frightening moments he had first experienced years before during his trip to Europe. It had been in Paris when Tom first suffered what was most likely an anxiety or panic attack.
In French, they were called Les Diables Bleus, Blue Devils, and he always called them the Blue Devils. And it was more than just a panic, it was a desperate feeling, you know. And it was odd what brought him on. Sometimes there was no particular reason that you could see.
And these would plague him the rest of his life. He would live in fear that this was a sign of a failing heart, or worse, a descent into mental illness like his sister's. It was because of these attacks and concerns about his health that Tom was allowed to quit his job at the shoe company and get on with his life. He was planning now to take night classes at Washington University near his home and eventually finish his degree. And now he had more time to devote to writing, submitting poems to journals and entering contests offering cash prizes. And he was beginning to be recognized as one of St. Louis's promising young writers. His Sonnets for the Spring wins first place and $25 in a poetry contest held by the well-to-do ladies of the Wednesday Club, a cultural organization headquartered in the Central West End. The newspaper article announcing the winners mentions that the 24-year-old had also won the Writers Guild Short Story Contest a year before. He was out of the warehouse, but all that he had seen and heard and the people he had met was finding its way into his writing.
Williams later said he really was glad he had that experience because it showed him what all these routine life these people led.
The labor relations there were very tenuous. St. Louis at that time, this was in 1936, there were strikes, major strikes going on all around the city.
Tom now found inspiration in the political and social conflict, especially in the short plays he was beginning to write. He was also influenced by the writers and artists that made up his new circle of friends. Many of them had strong ties to socialism and communism.
He was part of the social circle who would go to the taverns down on the waterfront, and Williams was part of that from time to time.
In his earliest plays, Tom Williams would write about coal miners, prisoners, and the down-and-out residents of a riverfront flophouse.
And you still see it in Streetcar Named Desire, where the focus of the play is on a working-class family and what goes on in that household.
It is only a footnote, but one of the friends Williams made at the warehouse was named Stanley Kowalski. The Williams family was never down and out. In the middle of the Depression, they moved into this rented house on Pershing Avenue in University City. It was just a short walk from the Washington University campus, where Tom was enrolled in classes to finish his degree in writing. He still thought of himself as a poet. But earlier that year, he had seen an acclaimed Broadway actress on tour in her most famous role. He was overwhelmed by the experience and the emotions, and said that was the moment when he began to think seriously about writing plays. And St. Louis turned out to be a good place to start.
This building used to be the auditorium for the Wednesday Club and was the home of the Mummers. They identified themselves as sort of the avant-garde little theater group that was doing things that were edgy.
If I say community theater group, you may get the wrong impression because it was avant-garde theater in those days. And it was organized by a man named Willard Holland, who was a kind of early mentor to Williams.
The fall he started at Washington University, the Mummers had asked Tom to write a short play to open one of its productions. And the following spring, the arts section of the paper reported that the Mummers would be staging another new work by Washington University senior Thomas Williams, Candles to the Sun, a play about coal miners in Alabama. Williams now was not writing in solitude. He was watching his work take shape on the rehearsal stage, working collaboratively with the actors and the director.
For a playwright, it's uncomfortable to be in the auditorium with an audience while they're seeing your first work. And I could imagine Williams just standing at the back of the house here, trying to gauge how it was going over. What did people think of things? Would they like it? Would they not like it?
The review in the Post-Dispatch said it was one of the strongest productions the Mummers had ever attempted. It said the young playwright Thomas Lanier Williams was not only a writer of unusual promise, but already one of considerable technical skill.
So it was really with these plays that he made the change from considering himself a poet and a short story writer to thinking of himself as a dramatist and a man of the theater. As he got into it, I think he did find these human connections with the Mummers. Those didn't come easily, and the Mummers as a group did seem to embrace him. They speak proudly of Tom Williams as their playwright.
He made a somewhat different impression at Washington University, where he never really quite fit in, although students recognized his talent.
I was editor of the literary magazine at Washington University called The Elliot.
A.E. Hotchner, who would later become known as Ernest Hemingway's friend and biographer, was one of Williams' classmates.
And so over the course of 6 issues of the magazine, we must have published a half a dozen of Tennessee's poems. And the next thing I knew, I was in a playwriting class with him called English 16, run by a wonderful professor, William G.B. Carson.
Students knew Tom Williams was a gifted writer, but it was also clear that he thought he was in a class by himself.
According to the accounts that I've heard, he sat alongside Professor Carson in this famous class, English 16, which was a class in one-act playwriting. So he sat opposite the other students, alongside the teacher. That's bound to make a lot of friends.
He also made his classmates uncomfortable with his loud, cackling laughter at the most inappropriate times. And he really wasn't one of them. He was older, published, and his plays were already being produced by the Mummers.
In some ways, that's why I think he fit into that theater group in some ways, maybe better than other kinds of groups, because the theater tends to attract a lot of oddballs and individuals with extreme personalities.
Literary scholars would later see in his early St. Louis plays, especially in his female characters, the playwright he would become. And classmates, years later, would realize that they had witnessed Williams moving from the political to the intensely personal. And they had heard what turned out to be the early drafts of The Glass Menagerie.
And Tom Williams wrote these little vignettes about his mother, who sold subscriptions on the telephone, about his crippled sister, and they just had class to them. They were very well written.
But Tom was not quite ready yet to become Tennessee. He was still living in St. Louis at home with his estranged parents and a sister whose mental illness was getting worse. He was still in college, and now it looked like he was not going to graduate in June. The Washington University Archives has a couple of items from Williams' year at the university, a carbon copy of a play entitled Me Vasha, donated by someone who realized years later that it was important as an early work of Tennessee Williams.
In the final exam, you didn't take an exam, you had to write a one-act play. And I just presumed that he would write about this family. But when the time came, Tom wrote a play called Me Vasha, about a munitions king of the world.
The opening stage direction is, it says, the scene is the study or library in the home of Sir Vasha Shantine, representative and leader of a huge munitions manufacturing corporation,
who had a map in the back of his desk, and he decided, well, I could use a war there, and he'd point, and then there'd be a war. It was simply awful.
Understandably, the fellow students, they saw this as something, outlandish and something that didn't speak to their lives, and certainly in contrast to the things that Williams had been bringing into the class, didn't make any sense.
It's consistent with the kinds of plays that were being written in the time. It's not a horrible play. It's just not what we expect. All through his life, not just at the beginnings and not just at the ends, he was always experimenting with different kinds of writing.
The three plays that were adjudged best would get produced, and he didn't even make honorable mention. And it infuriated him. He was so furious he didn't come to class anymore. He checked out of Washington, and he never forgave the university for that slight.
Another document in the archives shows, however, that the play was not his only disappointment. He had failed his Greek final and knew he could not graduate. On the back page, he left a record of his fragile emotional state.
It says, I am tired.
A poem written in pencil, which he titled Blue Song.
If you should meet me upon the street, do not question me, for I can tell you only my name and the name of the town I was born in. This sort of dialogue in Williams' own mind that he somehow doesn't belong, the problem that he must have felt about identity and about feeling rootless and a failure, an absolute failure at that point in his life.
Tom Williams remained in St. Louis that summer working on another political play for the Mummers and writing poetry. In the fall of 1937, he went to the University of Iowa and finished his degree in theater. 7 years later, in 1945, The Glass Menagerie opened on Broadway. The playwright, Tennessee Williams. Tom was now just a character, a young man stuck in a warehouse job in St. Louis, straining to break free of his family and follow his dreams.
Tom was a fighter, and he knew what he wanted to do from the beginning. And like many geniuses, he went at it in a strange way at times, but he always knew what he wanted to do.
He needed something to rebel against in order to find himself, and I think a lot of youth feels that way.
Often the students that I have who are most successful, it's not that they buck the system, it's that they have to find something else that works differently. And they have to do things kind of on their own terms.
He had never lost touch with his Southern roots, and Tom's reinvention of himself was so complete that many of the St. Louis years would be erased from his version of the Tennessee Williams story. But it was in St. Louis where he began to mature as a writer, and where he was first mentored as a playwright. Until his death in 1983, there was more of St. Louis and Tennessee Williams than people realized, and more than he would have wanted to admit.
Truth is that after he left St. Louis, many of his plays, which he placed in the South, were really about St. Louis.
In fact, he spent much more time in St. Louis than he ever did in New Orleans, which is the city that we associate with Tennessee Williams. And I think that's significant because those years are, in their own way, more elemental, I think. The years in which he went to the natatorium and when he was picked on, and of course his life here in St. Louis with his parents, which is conjured so beautifully in Glass Menagerie. All of that is fraught with images of childhood. Tennessee Williams found St. Louis a necessary adversary.
Funding for Living St. Louis is made possible through the Mary Rankin Jordan and Eddie A. Jordan Charitable Foundation and through the generous support of the members of the 9 Network of Public Media.